In Illinois, we have 51 watersheds, and a watershed is the place at which water drains off the land. And here we all live downstream of somebody. There is only one watershed that actually goes into Lake Michigan. All the rest end up in the Mississippi River, which is one of the reasons why it's so challenging for us to both protect our waterways, protect the Mississippi, and ultimately protect the Gulf of Mexico. We have some tools to work with. The most important tool that we have to work with probably is our Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972, along with the Clean Air Act. It is a bedrock policy that we rely on every day to protect the water that we drink from, that we fish in, swim in, recreate in, rely on for our survival. And back in '72, many of you probably participated in efforts to get that legislation passed. And Prairie Rivers, along with other organizations across the country, have used this as a tool to help communities protect their water supply, to restore rivers and wetlands and other water bodies to better function, to protect fish and wildlife, and make sure that water is available for future generations. But what the law allows is for some activity to be regulated with permits and to put contaminants in water to certain limits. For some of those activities, the state sets the standard at which those contaminants or levels of contaminants are allowed in water. Drinking water standards are national, and there are a handful of contaminants that are regulated at certain levels. So communities must, if they supply drinking water to the community, they must regulate to that standard. Other activities on the landscape are not regulated, however, and any measures to control contaminants going into water are voluntary. But it does require, the Clean Water Act does require states to prioritize waters that are impaired and to come up with plans to clean them up. In Illinois, there are about 2,700 surface waters that are impaired in one way or another by a variety of contaminants coming from point and non-point sources. Illinois EPA prioritizes those regularly and provides resources from the federal government to help clean up those water bodies. So most Illinois surface waters are somehow impaired for their designated uses, whether that's drinking, recreating, fishing, etc. There are a variety of causes of these impairments. We've heard about nitrogen and phosphorus a little bit already from both from agricultural activities as well as from industry, but also just from surface water draining off of paved landscapes. Because we have such urbanized concentration and now expanding sprawl, not just in Chicago, but in other areas of the state as well, that's contributing to problems of runoff from those areas. We are, despite increasingly improved technology to deal with both stormwater issues as well as sanitary problems, where we've got too many nutrients coming from sanitary outflows. We are beginning to see improvements in that, but that is a long time coming. That is technology that is expensive for communities to adopt, and we're going to have to make those investments if we want to see those improvements. We're very pleased that MWRD has invested a great amount of money to begin to lay the groundwork for others to follow and learn from. And we hope to see increasing improvements from that in the future. But as you can see, agriculture, sewage treatment, combined sewer overflows, urban stormwater are not the only sources of contaminants in our water. And we're going to need to deal with these other things too. Nutrient pollution is coming not just from Illinois, but across the upper Mississippi River Basin. It's contributing to a dead zone that's growing. It is now the size of Connecticut and expected to get bigger before it begins to get smaller. All of the states in the upper Mississippi River Basin are engaged in efforts to try to reduce nutrient pollution coming particularly from agricultural sources. It's very challenging. Trying to help farmers adopt new practices at a time when They are very challenged by other things like farm economics, makes the idea of switching practices very costly, but also just very challenging from a practice perspective. We expect to see a huge turnover of farm ground within the next 10 years due to demographic causes and economic challenges. And we really need to work with the next generation of farmers to help them embrace new practices and think about new ways of farming that protect soil, that protect water, that protect biodiversity, and protect local communities. So the dead zone that we're seeing in the Gulf of Mexico, we're one of the largest contributors to it because of the amount of water we have flowing into the Mississippi and ultimately the Gulf. But it's not the only problem that we're seeing with water quality related to nutrient pollution. Increasingly, Illinois and other states in the Midwest are seeing the impacts of nutrient pollution in their own surface water, and it's contributing to algal blooms that can actually have pretty detrimental effects on health. And again, this is something that we need to be increasingly attentive to and concerned about. But nitrates are not the only, just in surface water, we're also finding them in groundwater. Illinois, like other states in the Midwest, are increasingly seeing levels of nitrates that exceed drinking water limits. And even elevated levels of nitrates are contributing to public health concerns. There's growing evidence that they may be related to certain kinds of cancer. Nitrate removal systems are very expensive for communities to adopt and maintain. And even some of our smallest communities and villages in central Illinois are finding that they have to buy this technology. And that can force some communities to think about giving up their local control over their local water systems. So this is something that, again, we need to be attentive to. Dick mentioned sediment as a problem. I call this the silent but very expensive filler. It is amazing the rate at which we let go of something so precious as our soil. And just an example of how problematic this is, in the watershed that I live in, the Upper Sangamon, which drains into Lake Decatur, which is the drinking water reservoir for the city of Decatur, they are now, for the second time, having to dredge their reservoir to assure they have enough capacity, volume, to be able to meet their drinking water needs into the future, to the tune of $92 million. And that is an extreme amount of money to remove a bunch of dead sediment that cannot be reused, that has lost all life, and will end up having to be brownfill somewhere. It is really a disaster for that community have to pay that amount of money to ensure that they have adequate drinking water. But this is not just a problem, again, for Decatur. We're losing soil at a fast pace all over the state, and this is something that is again, very costly and time-intensive to replenish. It takes a lot of time, and this is where our food comes from, folks. So something else that we need to be attentive to. Shifting gears from agriculture, another threat to our waters in Illinois is the legacy of coal combustion. And that is essentially coal ash. Coal ash is what is left after coal is burned in a coal-fired power plant. The coal ash is stored in some kind of a ground collection, whether it's a surface pile or usually it's a pit dug in the ground that's unlined, filled with the ash that's coming out of the power plant, and then topped with water to keep the ash from blowing around in the air. The problem with all of that, of course, is that it's putting pressure on the cone that it's poured into, and some of these are beginning to leach into groundwater. You may have seen recently that there are reports about the impacts to groundwater around these plants all over the country, and they're finding heavy metals and other types of toxins that are leaching into groundwater. That groundwater could be people's drinking water. But it also poses problems for surface water where these are located next to rivers, and most are. They can potentially become destabilized and leach into the river. This is a picture of the pits over on the Middle Fork River near where I live in Vermilion County. These pits are adjacent to the bank of the river, and we believe are beginning to leach heavy metals into the river. This is a picture of the bank there. This river, like most rivers, meanders. It's a natural river, which is why it was designated our state's only scenic river in the Federal Wild and Scenic Rivers program. We're very concerned about the impact to surface water if that bank were to become further destabilized, and to Danville, which is downstream, and uses this water for its drinking water as well. Of course, we have a long legacy of coal mining in this state. It is one of the activities that brought economic prosperity to Southern Illinois for decades. People are still engaged in coal mining in central and southern Illinois, but we recognize that coal will probably be surpassed by renewable energy in the future, and so we'll see less and less coal mining. We have gone to a system of mining called Longwall Mining, where a large piece of equipment goes in and basically removes all of the seam of coal from underneath the surface, and then the coal is removed, but nothing is put in its place, and so it quickly will cave in or subside. The chemicals that are used in this type of coal mining produce acid runoff that are harmful to area streams and water bodies. These abandoned mines, once they subside, can pool with water and become problematic for area wildlife and fish habitat. And these are very expensive to clean up, to mitigate. Right now, Illinois is not a recipient of mitigation funding from the federal government. We hope that that opportunity comes to us like it has to other states in the Appalachian Coal Belt region. So we see this as an opportunity in the future for communities in southern Illinois to engage in cleaning up these areas and restoring them to their original, we hope, beauty at some point. But that's going to take resources. Lake Michigan, just now to do a little tour of the water resources in the state. Lake Michigan, our most important freshwater resource, has many stressors. This map that was produced by the University of Michigan sort of gives you a sense of the cumulative stressors for each of the Great Lakes. And Lake Michigan is among the highest stressed because of the level of development along the lake shore. There are a number of different threats to the lake. Some that we're very concerned about include the two-way exchange of invasive species in the lake. You probably heard a lot of talk about Asian carp getting into the lake and the concerns about what it would do to the ecosystem. But there are lots of nasty critters in the lake coming the other way and have the ability to get into our river system, to make their way down the Illinois River and up into the larger Mississippi River Basin and wreak havoc along the way. Again, the lake area and the communities that the lake serves are threatened with aging infrastructure, water quality, drinking water quality concerns that stem from that. And again, funding is a huge threat. We don't know what funding for infrastructure will be. We've invested a lot of money in restoration for the Great Lakes and are seeing good results from it, but we need to make sure those investments continue. We also should be concerned about the aging pipeline that is crosses the Straits of Mackinac and has been identified as a potential threat of leakage that could end up harming the shoreline of Lake Michigan and the other lakes. So again, things that we should be watching for. The Illinois River Basin, which ends up being the collecting point for everything coming off the land and going into the water from Chicago because of the reverse engineering of the Chicago River, is the recipient of 95% of Illinois' urban activity and 46% of Illinois' agricultural activity. That's a big load on one poor little river. But is a thriving river, and it is important to keep that in mind. Efforts of a number of groups, including the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Prairie Rivers and others help to restore wetlands and floodplains along that river that are critical for ensuring that the river is healthy and is able to flood where it needs to, when it needs to, and when it does that, it soaks up contaminants like nutrients. To the extent that we cut it off from its floodplain, it can't function the way it needs to, and it doesn't function the way it needs to for us. The river itself is a recipient of a lot of sedimentation that's flowing off of the land, but also dredging and other kinds of mining for sand that gets dumped into the river and causes problems with flow. So we need to take care in how that river continues to flow. It also has problems with invasive species, and we need to be looking at the ecosystem functions and making sure that we're not allowing too many contaminants in the river that are harming those ecosystems. Some good news that I think Amy will share about the impacts of the nutrient loss reduction strategy is that we are seeing a reduction in nitrogen rates in the river. However, we're seeing increasing phosphorus. So again, that's probably tied to urban activity. The Mississippi is our big engine in the state. We share it with the whole basin, but it's a major source of tourism and recreation for us. And people who are asked about their perceptions of the Mississippi really view it in that way, not just as an economic engine. It's a drinking water source, and again, something that we need to do our part to protect. We don't spend much time thinking about the Ohio River, although we do have 122 shoreline miles. We are at the bottom of that watershed, so everything that happens above us impacts the people who drink from it. It is controlled or designated by a multi-state authority that sets pollution standards. That's called Orsanco. Illinois has a seat at that table. We are concerned about recent efforts to reduce the standards for pollution control and revert those back to the states, which would likely set lower standards than what we would like to see that are currently set. Again, this is something that we need to pay attention to. What's the biggest threat to Illinois' waters? It's probably that we don't have a cohesive water strategy, that we expect to turn on the tap and drink whatever comes out and not think about where it comes from or how it got to us or how we protect it along the way. We need to really elevate water as an issue in the state. We need to ensure that communities have equitable and reliable access to clean, safe drinking water, and we need to invest in that. It isn't something that we could invest in 100 years ago and expect to serve us well 100 years into the future. So I look forward to working with all of you on developing that agenda and really helping to educate others about it. Thank you.